Sabrina 2000s comic, issue 39. Hilda says her feet are killing her and asks what witches are doing shopping the mortal way as they're walking home holding bags of groceries. Zelda says they shouldn't use their powers frivolously. I miss the 70s comic and the 90s comic, where she never had the stupid idea in her head. And you'd think that they'd get rid of this stupid concept nobody liked, because they're kind of back to the 90s comic art style. It's just objectively entertaining to see magic happen more. So how do the writers not know this? She doesn't want people to get suspicious because they're using magic, but one memory erasing spell is all it would take to take care of that. And since I know they can drive, why didn't one of them drive home with the groceries? Why did Hilda let Zelda boss her around instead of having the backbone she had in the 70s? She'd just warp. They see magic coming out of the chimney because someone's using too much magic in the house. That doesn't explain it. They go into the house and see some snacks flying towards the family room. The animated series is done. She's not a kid anymore. So there's absolutely no excuse whatsoever for Aunt still acting like she's not allowed to use magic. And the story contriving a dumb excuse for them to complain at her for it. They didn't act like this in the 90s comic. She'd hate hearing all of her CDs at once, so why would she do it? She changes outfits a few times, like, in the 70s and sitcom. And she's told she's being frivolous with her powers, making me wish 70s Della was here to say that if you don't use your magic, it'll rust away. It's so forced and arbitrary that apparently using too much magic in one house causes magic exhaust to fly out of the chimney. That never happened in any story before. Probably because the writers knew it'd be stupid. Zelda says Sabrina must use her magic wisely. There's nothing unwise about what she was doing. It was only a mistake because the writer forced that magical exhaust to be there. Salem says use it or lose it, like Della would. And Hilda randomly brings up that he tried to take over the world with his powers, which has no relevance to the conversation. Which makes it official that him being turned into a cat for that reason is still canon to this, even though it sort of has the 90s comic art style, and takes place in its time period. Zelda thinks Sabrina would turn out like Salem, for no reason at all, and decides to ground her for a week. I hate these characters so much. She won't be able to go anywhere in town without their permission other than school. With the way they treat her, it's a wonder this isn't all the time. I'd imagine it'd always be like that. I get wanting to make sure she won't create magical exhaust, but couldn't that be prevented by simply zapping up something to keep something from getting out of the chimney? Why even have a chimney? Sabrina's reading a book and she's still bored after only a few hours trapped in her house. Play video games. Hilda talks to her condescendingly, and her aunts get to go out for dinner plans in the other realm while she has to stay here. I have a question. Wouldn't it be more merciful to just use magic on Sabrina so that she knows exactly how much magic is too much and stops? Sabrina wants to use the internet to chat with some friends, and Salem says modern technology is wonderful, and says that she can even add an attachment to an email. Because he said that for no reason, she decides to turn her and Salem for no reason into computer files, attach them to an email, and go to Hawaii. So she would just be warping herself to Hawaii. She wouldn't need the computer. This is convoluted. Shouldn't Sabrina be worried that her all-powerful aunt would be able to find out she went away and find out where she went? I'm just remembering the 70s cartoon where Hilda heard that she was going to use her powers for good and teleported to her to tell her not to. Oh, how convenient. She actually does have a pen pal in Hawaii, who she calls Cyber Pal, which is stilted dialogue. Somehow, they weren't sent to Hawaii, because their email was rerouted due to an improper address out of nowhere to a night-filled empire of lost email that wouldn't exist. Because they're the first live attachments, somehow, how few witches are on Earth? These people that shouldn't exist want to take her to their supreme leader. Salem tells Sabrina to use her powers to get them out of this loony bin. This story is a loony bin. If the writer had common sense, he'd actually make her get them out of here in the very next panel. But instead, he forces her powers to be compressed in this digital form for no reason at all other than to pad out the story, when it could have easily just had her warp home, and written the story to continue from that point. Oh, it's punishing her for not putting up with being grounded. Why would she? In all of their centuries of being witches, her aunts obviously would have encountered this problem before and made it so that magical exhaust couldn't go through the chimney again. They get taken to the king, who looks stupid, and Salem somehow isn't injured and bleeding after being hit with a spear when he satisfyingly tells them, "With magic, you moron!" Yeah, he should have known that. He wants to go to Sabrina's world because he's tired of just ruling a kingdom of lost email. Salem tells him that world domination isn't all it's cracked up to be, but doesn't explain why. But if he did, that wouldn't convince him because he never got to rule a world. So he's not able to tell him that, say, he'd have a much larger workload having to run more places. She says she'd never allow him to come back with her, stupidly saying this to his face. So go figure, she gets given prison time. She would have just told him her powers are weak in this form. Instantly, Hilda and Zelda show up, because when they got home, they saw that her email was still up and did the same thing she did. Sabrina says that her friend in Hawaii must have closed her account. Why did she do that? Why didn't she tell her she was gonna close her account and give her the other email? She must have decided she was tired of Sabrina. The 70s comic made me have to resist the urge to laugh because of how amusing it was to talk about. The king says that he has to be taken with them. Hilda agrees, and Zelda winks at Sabrina while saying he doesn't seem so bad. They all try to pool their weakened powers, and Sabrina says poor Greenville because she's a complete idiot who somehow forgot about how powerful witches are normally. It's immediately obvious they would just be able to instantly point at the bad guys and stop them as soon as they'd get home. Hilda does realistically send them back into the computer. Salem thanks the aunts for their quick thinking that Sabrina would have had instead of being honest. She says she'll never disobey them again. I doubt that. If you want to teach the lesson to obey your parents, you have to make the parents sympathetic. And Zelda decides to take her flying vacuum too, just in case. She can still warp, can't she? Why didn't she simply directly warp to Hawaii? This whole plot was forced and belongs in the garbage bin. I need a break. Morton says the holidays is a lot of fuss over nothing and is called a grouch because Salem can't keep quiet, even around mortals, when he usually didn't have that problem in the sitcom. Morton would wonder where he was hearing the clearly male voice from. Sabrina wants to figure out how to draw out Morton's holiday spirit. Why would he have any? I don't blame him. Not everyone has to get excited over a holiday. Especially not when it seems like the only so-called loved one he has in life is a wife who doesn't even like him. Sabrina creates a Christmas tree and expects to impress him with it. He says it's just gonna drop needles everywhere. That's why I always have fake trees for Christmas. He's right. She does actually get humored. And he says it reminds him of his childhood. Later on, he throws it out because it had squirrels in it wrecking his house, because Sabrina zapped up a fresh tree. That wouldn't happen. She would have just created a new one from scratch, like I naturally assumed. He conveniently doesn't hear Salem whispering. Sabrina says that Morton didn't say no holiday items outside his house. She magically decorates and tells him to plug something in for him. He complains about an intense brightness as I sense another diabolic ex machina. This story doesn't even have a good message that not everyone has to love Christmas, because Morton's being portrayed as just a grouch, not agreed with by anyone. Predictably, something goes wrong. There's a power overload, and the power goes out across the whole neighborhood. Out of nowhere, Morton invites everyone into his house because he's got plenty of firewood, apparently. And the strangers want to pop popcorn over a fire and sing carols while he'd play the guitar. She gets asked for that tree again, and the story ends with them suddenly enjoying Christmas. Good thing there was a happy ending. I would expect her grumpy neighbor to ever do this. In the next story, Sabrina asks Salem if he has any special plan for the holiday when it's immediately obvious he wouldn't because he's a cat. How is she that dumb? And yet she knows a word that Hilda has to look up. He's not interested in getting excited over the holidays. And Sabrina changes his form and shows him his reflection, revealing that she turned him into a reindeer because she won't just accept Salem for who he is. This is the second story in a row telling you not to accept people who don't care about Christmas for who they are. How does this writer feel about people who don't even celebrate Christmas, who celebrate different holidays instead? Sabrina arbitrarily didn't just brainwash him into loving Christmas, even though she said she would zap him into a form where he'd have to. He wouldn't have to love it just because he was turned into a reindeer. She's already not respecting who he is, why is she against brainwashing? Instead, he destroys a couch, and Zelda says the house is no place for a reindeer and says goodbye. How does she not know where she sent him? She'd have to imagine where he was sent, wouldn't she? At least the 70s continuity explained that they get their powers from the mystic spirits, and occasionally they ask them for help in their spells, so I could assume the spirits got it wrong. Hilda says that from the intensity of her zap, she thinks Salem was sent downtown. Zelda says to let him find his own way home then. So now she's irresponsible. This just makes me hate her even more for being a strict, fun-hating parental figure, because she's a hypocrite too. Salem wouldn't be able to find his way home. Oh, lucky for him, he knows this intersection, so he does know the way home. He sees a crying little girl and asks her if he could help her. Luckily, she doesn't freak out and run away screaming. I guess it's because she's a kid and he's a reindeer. The store closed early for Christmas Eve when she came here with her list for Santa. And she came here alone, despite her age. Salem tells her to stuff the list in his collar and hop on so that he could take her to her family. She says cool and asks why he's not flying, and he says he's conserving his energy for tonight. She thanks him, he goes home, and he risks Zelda using magic on him again when he calls her Miss Zap Happy. Salem explains the situation, and Sabrina says she'll have to fill the list. She goes to her house that night and sees that the items are under the tree already, because of Santa, because it's a lame kids comic. Santa already knew what gifts to give her, and the kid thanks Salem anyways. And Sabrina says she's one of Santa's helpers. And when the kid asks her to use magic to fly the reindeer to catch up, she uses magic to make Salem fly. The first story was terrible. For no reason, suddenly using too much magic causes magic exhaust to come out of the chimney. And Zelda's scared of people finding out about magic, so she punishes Sabrina with grounding in the hopes that she won't do it again, instead of finding all of her neighbors and erasing their memories of the magic exhaust. It'd obviously be less obnoxiously cruel to just alter her mind so that she'll know when the next spell will create magic exhaust and decide not to do it. But that'd be too much thinking for someone who'd rather just lash out at someone and punish them on impulse whenever she's mad. I can't even remember a time when the 70s Hilda grounded Sabrina. And she was a stereotypical evil witch. I think maybe she did it once, when she wanted her to do her homework. I know Sabrina made a mistake, but that doesn't make it enjoyable to see her suffer for it. And then suffer even more because the writing forced her to get trapped in a bullshit civilization that wouldn't exist just because she couldn't email herself to her friend in Hawaii out of nowhere, and was too stupid to simply warp there like a normal witch. She stupidly doesn't humor the king when he wants to go try to take over a world, so of course he puts her in the dungeon and her aunts have to do the thinking instead. And somehow their powers are weaker in this place, for no reason other than to forcefully pad out the story with barely any plot material to it. The second story was about Sabrina not tolerating Morton's lack of enthusiasm for Christmas, and instead using magic to give him a tree, which somehow has squirrels in it. And she turns on a bunch of Christmas decorations that glow, which creates a power outage in her entire neighborhood. Miraculously, he does a complete 180 and lets the strangers in his home because he has firewood, and he starts enjoying his Christmas. Well, that's good, but confusing. And we have a third story where once again Sabrina doesn't tolerate someone not being excited for Christmas, even though he's trapped as a cat. He has every reason to not be very excited for his life. And Sabrina turns him into a reindeer, when it'd be less cruel to make him enjoy Christmas. Then when he tries to nap on the couch anyways, he destroys it, and Zelda warps him downtown, even though she could just magically replace the couch, and irresponsibly leaves him alone to find his way home himself in the cold. This could have very easily gotten him killed. And I bet if Sabrina did this, she'd get grounded. And she'd get grounded if she told Zelda what a frivolous use of magic that was. If this was the 70s comic, Sabrina would have called her aunt out on what she did, immediately warped Salem back home and turned him back to normal. She would have simply sent Salem to the backyard. At least he was shown to have a soft side when he felt sorry for a kid. But because she got her presents from Santa regardless, it was all just a waste of his time. So no wonder I was annoyed by the ending. That once again lies to children. Lucky for Sabrina, she wasn't punished for turning him into a reindeer. She had good Hilda and Zelda around this time. Now why can't it always be like this? Sabrina 2000s comic, issue 40. Hilda wakes Sabrina up, telling her that it's her turn to zap up breakfast. uncharacteristically calling her Brina. At least she's allowed to zap up breakfast. You'd think she'd dismiss that as too frivolous. She's tired and instantly dresses herself with magic and does her hair. But somehow it's only temporary with her hair. She's asked for blueberry muffins for breakfast. I guess it makes sense because they've been alive for so long that they're really bored. To the point where they'll have snacks for breakfast. They hate the breakfast, and tell her that her spell posture is poor and she'll have misshapen magic her whole life. So despite her constantly using magic in the previous issue, implying that she was if anything an expert, Zelda decides to send her to spelling school, an after-school witchcraft program in the other realm, based off just one measly morning of her doing a half-assed job with magic when she was clearly really sleepy. You know, maybe she just didn't visualize everything right because she was tired from just waking up. Are they really too stupid to figure that out? Because it was obvious immediately. That's the excuse for why she ends up going to spelling school? Enchantress sent her to a witch school before. It'd actually be better if Enchantress sent her to the spelling school because she did this before so she could do it again. She doesn't know her very well, so of course she thought she needed help with magic. Sabrina tells Harvey next afternoon that she has to go to spelling tutoring after school instead of hanging out at the pizza parlor with him. When he says she aced her vocabulary test this week, as if I'm supposed to think Sabrina's smart now, she lies that her French spelling is the problem. He kisses her and says to meet him if she finishes. And she goes to the school and meets a guy with a ridiculously out-of-place blue-haired anime design. And he asks her if this is a spelling class because he can't read his own handwriting. Somehow. Wow, he's really dumb. And she immediately thinks he's cute. But she won't want to date him right away. So she shouldn't have been written to think that. It's also very distracting and hard to take seriously that his name is Shinji. It just reminds me of a character from Evangelion. I never watched the show, but I heard about it. Shinji says he's impossibly bad at magic to an unbelievable extent. That's supposed to be why he's here? He'll get attacked and not a cat? That's forced. She laughs and is told to stop by her teacher, who also looks silly. And I'm not immediately told that she's an alien to explain why she's out of place too. In the comedy page, Sabrina says Salem will never be a wizard again. Male witches were always called warlocks in this franchise. How did they make this mistake again instead of being corrected? She advises them to make friends with other cats, and she gets called by him, and it turns out he made friends with Josie and the Pussycats, who aren't freaked out at his talking and standing upright. So he must have explained everything to them. So the teacher uses magic to give the students their ugly yellow uniforms, and even changed Shinji's hairstyle. Not that she makes it a good hairstyle, when you'd expect her to do that for the same reason why she would change their hairstyles in the first place. She wants them to pair up, and he randomly says to her that his ponytail makes him irresistible, foreshadowing the fact that he's into her. And she's into him, and yet she's still gonna refuse to date him. So she's only written a crush on him to cause drama, as a cheap way of getting the audience interested easily. It's not even like he does anything really impressive, and that's the only reason she ends up having a crush on him. It's not like he does something impressive that endears him to the audience. She literally just finds him attractive right away, and that feels more cheap, lazy, even if it is realistic. I remember her easily accepting a date from the school star quarterback, and trying to get a saxophone player impressed with her at school, but that was just 2 instances all the way back in the 90s comic. Now she won't admit that she has a crush on another guy. Now she's faithful, with no mention whatsoever to the fact that she used to crush on other guys. Harvey's eating pizza alone, and we don't have to see them somehow failing to use magic. It's not good writing because it's not believable at all, so we should never be shown this again. It doesn't take any writing talent to think up, let's have a character screw up magic. You could pull some random spells out of a hat. That doesn't impress me with the story. They wouldn't need to work together to create a frog. All witches are known for turning people into frogs. I know the fans of the sitcom hated when Harvey and Sabrina broke up and the show started characters shilling Josh and Aaron as new love interests for her. So why would the comic writers do anything similar? It's not like this is 70s Harvey where he's intentionally a terrible love interest for her, and so him being the chew toy felt right instead of mean-spirited, because it's not like he's the main character that the audience is supposed to relate to. It's not like Harvey's the kind of person where I'd want her to date someone else. And even if that was the case, I'd just be frustrated and bored with how long it's taking for her to dump him. Since when does Harvey call Sabrina to say goodnight to her? She's asked by her aunts in the morning if she picked up any pointers, and the story ends with Salem fat from her muffins. In the next story, Ambrose warps to Salem and is asked what took him so long. And he asks Salem what's the emergency and says he just got his email. I guess it's not an emergency. He's told that Sabrina and her aunts went shopping, and before they get back, he needs Ambrose to pretend to be him in front of a girl who's been Salem's internet chat room pal and wants to meet him. Salem was so flattered he didn't think before agreeing. Ambrose agrees and asks why the girl wanted to meet him at the zoo. This immediately made me wonder if the twist was that she's a transformed witch herself and is doing the same thing, and I assumed that because I already saw a story where Salem had to face a girl as himself just to find out she was turned into an animal too. It turns out she invited Salem to the zoo because she works there. She thanks Ambrose for complimenting her appearance, and he compliments her outfit. The hair really helps. She says that she loves animals, and Ambrose has to lie that his cat is named Ambrose, not Salem. Naturally, Salem's mad because Ambrose is getting cozy with Leslie and he can't. So he pokes Ambrose. She says that if he's tired of sitting, they could have a walk. And she's somehow not reacting at all to what just happened to him. She says she wanted to talk about the internet chat. She admits it wasn't her, and Leslie was a gorilla who uses sign language all along. This shouldn't have been so predictable. I didn't expect a gorilla, but an animal was obvious. She's even been taught to read and type. It needs to be explained that this is a transformed witch, because how could a mere gorilla be smart enough in a chat room about whatever probably human subject Salem was talking about, that he wouldn't notice? Leslie looks disappointed at seeing Ambrose and wrote a message saying that she was hoping for someone hairier. Too bad the story ended there. It should have ended with Salem revealing that he can talk, and so he has something in common with her after all. In the next story, Hilda comes back home from the park. Why did she go there? Salem says that she brought home a sick squirrel one time, and Zelda says that Hilda's always looking out for defenseless creatures. This is quite a contrast to 70s Hilda. They're not animals, they're pixies. Zelda says they're fairies actually, and she hasn't seen any in ages. So this comic has to be retconning away the existence of that story where Sabrina was enslaved by a pixie. Or else she wouldn't call them cute at all and they'd hate each other. They knew Zelda was a witch because they didn't fly away. How convenient that they magically knew she was a witch. It's not explained that they sense their magical energy. Hilda says they don't speak. I wonder if that'll last. Hilda says she told them that they could stay here because it's freezing outside. Salem says fairies are forest folk. And Hilda thanks Zelda for humoring her and says they'd be perfect guests. Hilda hopes they'll get to stay forever. Then the fairy, go figure, can talk, and says she thought that annoying witch would never go to bed. If the fairies were gonna be the villains anyways, I hate that the characters were written to not remember the story where Sabrina was enslaved by one that explained that pixies are mortal enemies of witches, because it just has the characters act like ignorant idiots just to force the story to happen. Salem wakes Sabrina up because he hears tons of wings, and she tells Salem it's just his imagination, arbitrarily doubting the heightened senses of a magical cat. So the next morning, when they're the first to wake up, they find out there's a fairy infestation. Let me guess. They won't be able to simply zap them all away, like you'd expect. Her aunts show up, and she frees the fairy who thanks her because somehow, someone shut her in there without noticing. Hilda finds out that the fairy from last night is a queen, and when you invite the queen, you invite all her subjects, which is an official rule of the fairies, along with the rule that once they're invited, they can stay forever. Go figure, Zelda isn't able to warp the fairies away because the writer has no idea how to legitimately force the story to last longer. So the fairies are magically immune to magic just because they're invited here. So Zelda decides to leave the house with her family and retreat to the other realm and regroup, leaving Salem alone with fairies that want to ride him. Then the fairies get vacuumed up by another realm pet service. If this was the kind of thing fairies did, and there was a witch pest service for it, then Hilda wouldn't have been ignorant enough to make the mistake that would cause this whole plot to happen. She would have read about this happening to other witches, or been told about it. She would hate fairies. Instead, she cares about whether or not they're okay. And they're going to be released into a fairy preserve, because we definitely sympathize with them. The story ends with it turning out that Salem was vacuumed up, and it gets taken out and says a forced pun when Sabrina hugs him. The first story sucked. I can understand why Zelda would send Sabrina to a magic class for doing a half-assed job at spells, but how did nobody notice the fact that she was really sleepy in the morning? It's not like any of them reference her screwing up magic a lot more than this. You'd think they'd all realize that she only screwed up because she just woke up, which I thought was the case immediately. Zelda jumps at the chance to do this to Sabrina without waiting a day. The same people who wanted to punish her for using magic frivolously, why would they encourage her to use magic by sending her to a magic school? I didn't expect this. It should have been Enchantra's idea. It's not like she was great at magic this morning and they decided to send her anyways. But combined with the fact that multiple people are okay with this, that Salem doesn't tell them it's ridiculous. It still feels like the writer forced it to happen. And that's not remotely acceptable and respectable when you're having the concept of the spell school last more than one issue. This is gonna be an endless story arc. And what kind of exciting, magical, creative thing is the comic focusing on for this arc? Oh, it's just a typical love triangle. Never saw that before. At least it does a better job creating suspense over which guy she'll choose than Sally and Mina's love triangle. Because Sabrina immediately gets a crush on Shinji, while Sonic never showed any actual interest in Mina, and only dated Sally, making the writer's preference way too obvious. Even when he tried to give her a chance after she broke up with Ash for a bit, I felt like he was only resorting to her because he wasn't with Sally, since it came out of nowhere. This seems less pointless and misleading than that. But Harvey in the 90s comic isn't completely opposite to Sabrina in personality and constantly disagreeing with her and arguing with her. Neither is Shinji. They're both equally bland characters, who are impossibly dumb. Is she gonna date blue-haired Harvey, or real Harvey? Her dating Shinji won't change anything other than she'll be able to use magic in front of him, which would cause her trouble if she used it too recklessly. So she's actually safer dating Harvey. I wouldn't be surprised at all if it turned out that the writers only wrote this love triangle because the editors forced them to. Because that was the case with Mina and Archie. But there'd be nothing to the plot without it. It's just a dumb story where Sabrina is suddenly horrible at magic class, even though she went back in time by herself twice. There's no plot there, and the only thing interesting is something that a million other franchises have already done, with or without witches. And while this feels like the first time this franchise did it, it just seems like an admission that it ran out of good ideas. The second story is about Salem going to meet with his pen pal with Ambrose posing as him because he doesn't want to reveal that he's a cat. I predicted that his pen pal would turn out to be an animal from the start, because I already read a story where he was worried about this. But at least the story threw me off for a minute by having a girl meet Ambrose and explain that she invited him to the zoo because she works there. That made it surprising that his pen pal was a gorilla in particular. But still, the gorilla wouldn't be entered in Salem's chat room. I sure wish I knew what they were chatting about. The third story only happened because the writer ignored the fact that witches and pixies are sworn enemies. So Hilda wants some fairies to stay at her house, but they arbitrarily invite a whole bunch of other fairies to join their queen, when obviously they'd just get in trouble, and they get vacuumed up by a fairy pet service. Shouldn't the fairies have been written to shapeshift to look like harmless, cute little creatures instead of fairies? Hilda would have known better if this was a thing that could happen to witches, and she's lived for hundreds of years. Because she has witch relatives, so surely one of them would have told her about this. She wouldn't have any sympathy for the fairies. Why make the fairies villains again?